Macy's soccer practice, and I want to read chapter 5, but I don't think I picked a very good parking spot. Yeah, I didn't think this one through. Sunroof works. This car is awesome. There's a guy running over there. Sorry, it's your kid's practice, sir, not yours. Chapter 5 of The Bloodpines. The whole town came out for the Jubilee, even if only to complain about it. The celebration carried a lot of history, both positive and negative, all of it personal. Most folks thought it was important to celebrate the boys who would start their walk to the Bloodpines the following day. There were other folks who thought the journey to manhood should remain a private affair. Some felt that it was a shame that girls were prevented from having their own rite of passage. And then there were the small, petty arguments that there was too much emphasis on baking, or maybe there wasn't enough. Everyone had an opinion. Folks mingled and chatted, and all went well until mid-afternoon when the beer cart rolled out. This was possibly the most contentious Jubilee tradition, except perhaps for the Jubilee dance, which the church protested energetically every year on the basis dancing was a sin. And dancing on a Sunday was an open invitation to the devil. But once the drink rolled out, the protesters moved from the dancing square to the beer cart, where they formed a neat and orderly line. When the beer started flowing, Jubilee truly got underway. That was when the stone-throwing and axe-swinging contests began. Incidentally, that was also when most of the injuries happened. Give a drunk man an axe and you're bound to see something hilarious or horrible. Either way, it was entertainment. Grace Burnham's eyes grew wide as Parr led her through the main square. Colored lanterns hung from the trees and on lines between poles. Fireworks erupted in the distance. Some clever rapscallions set off some firecrackers under the old school bell. The noise was astonishing. It took several minutes for the echoes to die out, and the ringing in people's ears lasted most of the night. Grace didn't utter a word. She didn't think she'd ever seen anything so beautiful as those colored lanterns. Parley patted her hand as they walked, chatting nervously. He led her through the crowd, keeping his distance from the seating areas where folks congregated. He was afraid that if anyone spoke to her, they would discover the deterioration of Grace's mental state. He couldn't allow that to happen. And it was no good staying home. People would notice her absence and ask awkward questions. One more pass through the town square, Parr thought. After that, he would take her back to their room above the schoolhouse, and she could stare out the window, open-mouthed, all she liked. Parr wasn't sure how he was going to handle the following morning when he and the other boys would set off for the Bloodpines. He was 14 and had only one leg. Most boys who took the walk waited until they were at least 16, and they made sure, whenever possible, to have 2 legs. What about his mother? He had already decided not to tell her he was going. In her current state, she probably wouldn't notice. But what if she snapped out of it while he was gone? And if she didn't, who would look after her? She certainly couldn't come to see him off, like the mothers of all the other boys, and someone was sure to notice. He would need to think of an excuse for her absence. "Hello, Grace, Parley." Parr hadn't been paying attention to where he was going, and had strayed too close to the pie table where a group of amused-looking women were gathered. He panicked and tried to turn his mother away, but one of the women, Fanny Stern, put a hand on his arm, holding him in place. "We were just talking about you," said Mrs. Stern. Parr watched his mother out of the corner of his eye. She was staring quite earnestly at Mrs. Stern's lips, which were stained red from whatever pie she had been eating. "Not to be indelicate, but it's been 7 years since poor old Abner passed away, and we were wondering if you'd had any thoughts about getting remarried." Several of the ladies at the pie table gasped. Several others stifled laughter. Judging by the smell of Mrs. Stern's breath, Parr guessed that she had made more than one trip to the beer cart before settling down with her pie and her gossip. She went on, "It's not unheard of, you know, not in this day and age. Why, look at Vivian Downey. Simon's her 3rd husband. I guess love didn't work out the first 2 times, so for number 3 she married for money." More gasps and laughter from the pie table. Parr didn't know what to do. Grace just stared at Fanny Stern's lips and nodded. "Excuse me," said a soft voice behind them. Fanny Stern looked over Parr's shoulder and stopped laughing, her sloppy smile replaced with a look of disgust. Parr turned and saw Mrs. Lester, the mother of James, the idiot. "Mrs. Burnham," she said in that same soft, respectful tone, "I was wondering if I might speak with you privately for a moment." She took Grace's hand and led her away from the pie table, Parr limping along behind them. Mrs. Lester reached back and slid her arm through Parr's and matched the speed of her walk with his. The trio walked through the crowd, not talking. Parr was terrified. He kept sneaking glances at his mother, who was craning her neck around to look back at the lanterns in the square behind them. Mrs. Lester didn't seem to notice. The three of them walked slowly away from the noise and the crowds, and Parr was relieved to discover that they seemed to be headed toward the schoolhouse. "I despise Fanny Stern," Rebecca Lester said conversationally. "I hope she drinks too much and wakes up with a head full of regret." They walked beneath a line of colored lanterns, and Parr's mother craned her neck to look at them. "How long has she been like this?" Mrs. Lester asked Parr, who was momentarily stunned into silence. "How did you know?" Parr finally asked. He was unable to keep the surprise from his voice. "My mother had the same. It came and went, but in the end it took her. It happened around the time your father passed." They walked around to the back of the school, and Parr helped his mother sit on the bottom step. "I don't know what to do," Parr said. "No one can find out. She'll be fine in a few days, but if anyone sees her like this, they won't let her teach anymore, and we'll be..." Mrs. Lester sat next to Parr's mother, holding her hand. "I understand. The best you can do is keep her safe, in bed if possible. She really should see Dr. Byrne, but I'm afraid he wouldn't be much help. I can't imagine that he'd know how to handle this. There's not much that can be done for this kind of thing." "He'd lock her up, wouldn't he?" asked Parr. "That would most likely be Dr. Byrne's recommendation," Mrs. Lester said sadly. Dr. Byrne had been practicing medicine in the area for 30-odd years and had more or less managed to disappoint everyone he encountered, one way or another. "And I couldn't stop him?" "No, I don't believe you could," said Mrs. Lester. She seemed almost as sad about it as Parr. "Ma'am," said Parr, "I have a favor to ask." Mrs. Lester looked up at Parr with her big, kind eyes. "I'm not going to be around for the next few days," he began, but Mrs. Lester gasped, and he stopped. "You're going to the Bloodpines, aren't you?" Her face had gone white. "Yes, ma'am." "You can't wait a year?" she asked, though her tone suggested that she knew he couldn't. "It has to be now. I doubt she'll be able to carry on teaching another year, and if I'm going to get work, I'll need to prove to folks I can do the job." Mrs. Lester nodded and looked sadder than ever. "Hard lives only get harder," she said. It was a depressing thought, but it strengthened Parr's resolve. "I'll only be gone a few days, but I don't feel right leaving her alone while I'm gone." Mrs. Lester reached out and squeezed Parr's hand. "I would be honored to look after your mother." Tears filled her beautiful eyes, but her smile was firm. That gave Parr strength. Next up is Chapter 6. Hope to see you soon.